Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here tonight. I'm Valerie Robitaille from Pure Alternatives, and tonight we're going to be talking about stress physiology, cortisol rhythm, nervous system patterns, recovery capacity, and why symptoms like fatigue, brain fog, poor sleep, cravings, anxiety, and that tired but wired feeling, why these states so often occur together. One of the biggest goals of tonight's discussion is to help make these patterns more understandable in simple, practical terms. A lot of people dealing with chronic symptoms have spent years feeling confused, dismissed, overwhelmed, or stuck in cycles of trying different things without really understanding what may be happening underneath physiologically. So tonight is really about stepping back and looking at the larger picture. We'll talk about how stress affects the body over time, why symptoms often cluster together, what recovery capacity actually means, why some people lose resilience and adaptability, and how these patterns can begin affecting sleep, energy, mood, digestion, inflammation, and nervous system regulation. This is not meant to diagnose or replace medical care. The purpose is education to help people better understand how the body responds to chronic stress and why symptoms often follow recognizable physiological patterns. And then at the end, we'll leave some time for questions and discussion together. So thank you again for being here. Let's get started. One of the most common patterns I see is what people describe as tired but wired. People often feel physically exhausted but mentally overstimulated at the same time. They may feel tired all day, unable to fully recover, dependent on caffeine or sugar to function, restless at night, mentally on even when exhausted, like their body never completely relaxes. And for many people, this becomes a cycle that slowly affects sleep, energy, cravings, focus, mood, digestion, stress tolerance, and overall resilience. A lot of people blame themselves when this happens. They think, maybe I'm lazy, maybe I just need to push harder, maybe I'm not disciplined enough. But very often, this is not a motivation problem, it's physiology. The body has built-in stress and survival systems designed to help us respond to pressure temporarily. The problem is that in modern chronic stress states, many people never fully shift back into recovery mode. So even though they're exhausted, the nervous system still behaves as though it needs to stay alert. That's why people can feel exhausted but unable to sleep deeply, tired but mentally overstimulated, and drained but reactive at the same time. Now, over time, this can affect cortisol rhythm, nervous system balance, inflammation, blood sugar regulation, and energy production. And eventually, the body starts prioritizing short-term survival over long-term recovery. And that's an important concept. The body is not weak, it's adapting. The problem is that these survival adaptations become exhausting when they stay activated too long. And this is why understanding stress physiology and recovery capacity matters so much. Because if we only look at isolated symptoms, we miss the larger pattern that may be driving them.
After each of the main numbered slides, I have these very technical, complex slides for you to look at later on your own time so that you could study more. I'm going to make the PowerPoint available to you with all of the information in there.
One of the biggest problems in chronic health situations is that people are often looking at symptoms one at a time. So someone may think brain fog is separate, or cravings are separate, poor sleep, anxiety, fatigue are all separate issues. But very often these symptoms are connected through the same underlying stress and recovery physiology. And that's important because many people start feeling confused when symptoms seem unrelated. They may think, why do I have digestive issues and anxiety? Why am I exhausted? Why is my sleep poor and my cravings worse at the same time? What I want people to understand is that the body works as an interconnected system. So, for example, stress hormones and nervous system signaling affect the brain, sleep cycles, digestion, inflammation, blood sugar, energy production, mood, immune function. So, when the system becomes dysregulated, multiple symptoms often appear together. That's why people frequently experience symptom clusters instead of isolated symptoms. So, for example, poor sleep can increase cortisol dysregulation, which affects blood sugar stability, which increases cravings, which worsens energy crashes, which increases nervous system stress, which worsens sleep again. The systems influence each other continuously, and over time, small dysfunctions across multiple systems begin accumulating until the person crosses a threshold where symptoms become difficult to ignore. That's why chronic stress physiology can look so different from person to person. One person may primarily experience anxiety and insomnia. Another may experience fatigue and brain fog. Another, digestive issues and inflammation. But the underlying driver may still involve the same stress response and recovery systems. This is also why symptom suppression alone doesn't fully resolve the larger pattern. Because if underlying physiology remains dysregulated, symptoms tend to shift or cycle or return in different forms. And this is one reason functional testing and pattern-based assessment can become helpful. Not because symptoms are imagined, but because symptoms are often connected through shared biology. The important takeaway here is your symptoms are real. They're connected, and the body is usually following understandable physiological patterns, even when those patterns feel overwhelming. One of the most important concepts I want people to understand is that the body adapts constantly. In the beginning, many stress responses are actually protective. The body increases stress hormones, alertness, blood sugar output, muscle tension, and nervous system activation because it's trying to help you cope with pressure. In short term, that can be useful. The problem is when the stress never fully resolves and recovery never fully catches up. And over time, the body starts shifting from temporary adaptation into chronic compensation. And this is where many people begin feeling like they are holding everything together while slowly becoming more exhausted underneath. The body keeps functioning, but at a higher biological cost. This is why people often continue pushing through work demands and emotional stress, poor sleep, inflammation, environmental burden, and chronic overload, even when their recovery capacity is steadily declining. Eventually, the body begins prioritizing survival over repair, and that is a major shift. The nervous system becomes more reactive. Cortisol rhythm starts flattening. Inflammation increases. Sleep becomes lighter and less restorative. Energy production becomes less efficient, and overall stress tolerance drops. So the person may still appear functional externally, but internally the body is working much harder just to maintain baseline function. And this is why symptoms often start multiplying over time. At first, it may only look like fatigue, then later poor sleep, anxiety, digestive changes, brain fog, feeling overwhelmed more easily. This is not because the body is broken. This is because compensation is expensive. And eventually, the systems that were helping you adapt begin contributing to the exhaustion themselves. One of the most important things to understand here is recovery is not laziness, recovery is biology. The body cannot rebuild effectively while it remains stuck in chronic overdrive. And this is why simply forcing harder, pushing harder, or ignoring symptoms often backfires in the long term. The goal is not to shame the body for adapting. The goal is to understand what it has been compensating for and create enough support and safety and recovery and regulation that the system no longer has to survive at that intensity. One of the most important concepts in chronic stress physiology is something called recovery capacity. Recovery capacity is essentially the body's ability to restore itself after stress, exertion, inflammation, emotional strain, poor sleep, illness, environmental burden, or everyday life burden demands. And one thing I want people to understand is that recovery capacity is not the same thing as willpower. Many people struggling with chronic symptoms are actually pushing very hard, but the body no longer has the same ability to recover and adapt efficiently underneath. This is why two people can experience the same stressor very differently. One person may sleep, recover, and return to baseline fairly quickly. Another person may crash for days, experience worsening symptoms, develop inflammation, feel mentally foggy, or just become completely depleted afterward. That difference often reflects recovery capacity and resilience. The body is designed to adapt temporarily to stress, but when stress becomes chronic and recovery becomes insufficient, the system gradually loses flexibility. This is where people often begin noticing reduced stress tolerance, poor recovery after exercise, feeling wiped out by normal responsibilities, increased sensitivity to foods or supplements, greater nervous system reactivity. You get the picture. And over time, many people cross what I think of as a resilience threshold. Before that threshold, the body may still compensate fairly effectively, but after that threshold, even relatively small stressors can start triggering disproportionately large symptom responses. And that's why some people eventually feel like, I used to handle so much more than this. And they're often correct. The body's available resources and adaptability have changed. This is also why people sometimes become frustrated when they continue pushing harder but continue feeling worse. Because adaptation is metabolically expensive. The body can't remain in chronic overdrive indefinitely without consequences to recovery, regulation, and energy production. One of the most important ideas I want people to understand is that symptoms often reflect reduced adaptability, not personal weakness. The goal is not simply forcing the body to perform harder. The goal is rebuilding enough support, regulation, nourishment, recovery, and resilience that the system can begin adapting more effectively again. One of the reasons I spend so much time talking about patterns is because symptoms usually do not happen randomly. Patterns tend to reflect physiology. And once we begin understanding the physiology, we can stop guessing and start becoming more targeted and strategic. What this slide is really showing is the difference between a system that's functioning in a healthy rhythm versus a system that has lost flexibility and recovery capacity. In a healthy rhythm, the body is designed to rise in energy during the day, gradually wind down at night, recover deeply during sleep, and regulate stress appropriately. It shifts between activation and recovery smoothly. The system is adaptable. But when stress becomes chronic and recovery becomes limited, those rhythms often flatten. And people begin noticing recognizable patterns like waking up exhausted, crashing during the afternoon, relying on caffeine or sugar, getting a second wind at night. It's a big one. Feeling tired but unable to sleep deeply and waking unrefreshed. What's important is that these are not just random experiences. They often are reflecting measurable physiological changes involving your cortisol rhythm, nervous system balance, inflammation, blood sugar regulation, and so on. And this is one reason testing can become so valuable because many people spend years in trial and error approaches without understanding what their body is actually doing underneath. They may try supplements, diets, stimulants, sleep aids, restrictive protocols, but without clarity about the underlying physiology, progress can become inconsistent or temporary. Testing helps move the conversation from what symptom do you have to what systems are driving the pattern. And once we identify those patterns more clearly, interventions become more individualized and more rational. Instead of guessing, we begin building a roadmap. Now, testing is not magic, and no test explains everything, but good testing can help us identify dysfunction earlier and reduce unnecessary guesswork. We can evaluate recovery capacity, uncover hidden contributors, and supremely personalized support strategies. And for many people, just finally understanding why they feel the way they do becomes incredibly important because uncertainty itself is stressful. So, what I want people to take away here is your symptoms are not all in your head. The body follows patterns. Patterns reflect physiology. And physiology can often be assessed and understood and supported much more effectively once we stop looking at symptoms in isolation. I want to end tonight by reframing the way many people think about healing and recovery. A lot of people living with chronic symptoms have spent years feeling like they need to push harder, ignore their body, force more productivity, or somehow fight through exhaustion. But the body isn't designed to thrive under constant survival pressure. It's designed to move rhythmically between activation and recovery. Stress itself is not the problem. The body can tolerate stress remarkably well when recovery is also present. The problem develops when the system stays activated for too long without enough restoration, regulation, nourishment, or recovery to balance it. Because over time, the body begins allocating more energy towards short-term survival instead of long-term repair. And this is where people often begin feeling disconnected from themselves physically. Sleep is less restorative, stress tolerance drops, energy becomes less stable, inflammation increases, and the nervous system starts acting up. And eventually, many people stop trusting their body altogether. But what I want people to understand is this. Very often, the body is not failing. It's adapting the best way it can under prolonged strain. Symptoms are frequently signals that recovery capacity has become overwhelmed and resources have become depleted or regulation has been lost. And when we begin supporting the body instead of constantly fighting it, physiology often becomes much more responsive. Healing usually happens gradually. Small, consistent improvements in sleep, light exposure, stress physiology, nervous system regulation, nutrition, recovery behaviors, movement, and restorative capacity begin accumulating over time. The goal is not perfection. The goal is rebuilding enough resilience and flexibility that the body no longer has to remain stuck in chronic compensation and survival mode. And I think that's the most important message I want people to leave with tonight. You do not have to keep pushing through. Your body is communicating, and with the right support, many people can begin restoring regulation, recovery, resilience, and the quality of life again. Thank you all for being here tonight and spending this time with me. I know many people dealing with chronic symptoms have often felt dismissed, overwhelmed, confused, or stuck in cycles of trial and error for a very long time. My hope tonight was simply to help make some sense of these patterns and make them more understandable. Because when people finally understand that their symptoms may reflect physiology rather than personal failure, it often changes the way they begin approaching healing. The body follows patterns, and many of those patterns can be assessed, understood, and supported more clearly once we stop looking at symptoms in isolation. So if you feel like you recognized yourself somewhere in tonight's discussion, the next step is not panic, it's clarity. And that may look like functional testing, a clinical pattern review, improving recovery capacity, understanding stress physiology, or identifying what your body may currently tolerate, or simply learning more about how these systems interact. You don't need to figure everything out tonight, and you don't need to force your body into healing. The goal is understanding the pattern first, then supporting the system appropriately. If you'd like to continue learning, you can use the QR code on the screen to explore the next steps, educational resources and services that I mentioned tonight. And if questions came up during the presentation, I'd be happy to spend the remaining time discussing them together. Thank you again for being here.